Welcome to another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. You're listening to a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State, featuring writer, poet, and musician Rick Pidcock. Now here's Rick.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Highest Power Church and State. I'm your host, Rick Pidcock, and today I'm recording from the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship in Jacksonville, Florida. It's always a fun time of the year to get to meet people and hang out, and this episode is being released as usual on Thursday night, so there's still one more day to go. So if you're here, feel free to come by and check out the Baptist News Global booth. We've got some t-shirts to give away. Executive Director Mark Wingfield has some books available, and I've got some bookmarks with info for my upcoming book, Weapons of Worship, How the Songs of Evangelicalism Form the Soundtrack of Extremism, and we'd love to see you there. It's also the eve of Juneteenth, and I know for many of us who grew up in white evangelicalism, it's not really a holiday that was on the forefront of our minds for most of our lives. I'd never even heard of it until I was 29 years old. And even then, it was because I left my white evangelical church over abusive power dynamics and visited another church that just so happened to celebrate it. So who knows how long it would have been before I had heard about it had I not had a church crisis and just so happened to visit that other church during that time of the year. Greg Garrett is a professor at Baylor, and he's also a senior columnist for Baptist News Global. And he has a book out this month titled White Lies, Dismantling 10 Cultural Myths About Race. So for today's episode, in honor of Juneteenth, I wanted to sit down with Greg Garrett to talk about white supremacist myth-making. We're releasing this conversation on the eve of Juneteenth, and in your book, you talk a lot about the myths of white supremacy that white people have been creating for over 4 centuries. But before we get into the myths that are created, there's also a lot of history that gets erased. Like, why was I 29 years old before I ever even heard of Juneteenth? And how does the erasure of Black history play into the white supremacy myth-making?
It's a huge part of it. And it is something that's continuing to gather steam under this current administration and a number of its allies in state and local governments. When Jemar Tisby talks about anti-racism work, he says that the first thing that you have to have is awareness. And if you don't have awareness, then everything else that might follow that disappears. So if we don't know about Juneteenth, if we don't know about the Tulsa Race Massacre, if we don't know that there was a period that came at the end of Reconstruction that white people called redemption, because it was rolling back all of their powers and reinstating them as the rulers of the universe. James Baldwin talks about this a lot, and I quote Baldwin a lot and think about Baldwin a lot in connection with the book. But what he would tell us is that history is essential because if we don't have history to rebut some of these myths, if we don't know, for example, that there was a period during Reconstruction when there was an entire class of Black senators and United States congresspeople, and we buy into the myths that Blacks are somehow less capable, less educated, less whatever, then there's nothing to stand in opposition to those myths. There's no counter myths to them. And so that whole question about awareness, I think, is an essential one, because without that awareness, without that history, then we can't tell the truth. And if we don't tell the truth, then there's no reason for us to act.
So one thing I've noticed, especially in the Freedom 250 events that have been going on this summer, is how white supremacists are creating myths about our nation's founding, where the founders were supposedly all born-again inerrantists who were pursuing revival. So, why is it so important to them to cast our founders in that way? And how does that translate into the harm they're causing today?
Well, a big part of it is, as you know, there's a strong movement among certain kinds of American Christians to take dominion over all the things of this world. And one of the things talking about it is the Seven Mountains mandate, the idea that Christians should be in charge of education, they should be in charge of culture, they should be in charge of business, politics, so on and so forth. It is a singularly un-Christian ambition, since we follow a savior who renounced worldly power, who said, my kingdom is not of this world. And who, even at the point of death, refused to exert force to remove himself from the cross. It's a complete misreading of the Christian narrative, but it serves people who look like you and me, because everybody else is diminished in the telling of that story. So if you look at the way the new Oval Office is decorated, there's something like, I don't know, 150 paintings in that, Oval Office now that's, covered with gold and gilded furniture. But all of those people up on the walls are white men, powerful white men, most of them presidents. I hear from the New York Times that Mr. Trump squeezed in a tiny portrait of Jackie Kennedy somewhere. I cannot find it. The press office has not responded to my queries. So if we think about the symbolism of the Oval Office, one powerful white man surrounded by a bunch of other powerful white men, many of them nominally Christian, but not necessarily in the way that these Christians would like to understand them, then it's a very self-serving kind of hierarchical way to use these myths. And that feeds into the sort of second part of your question, which is there's this attempt to use a certain kind of militarized American Christianity to say that white American men should be ascendant, black people, brown people, Asian people, gay people, women don't really belong in the seats of power. And if this was how our nation was founded, which it wasn't, but if it's how, foundational myths, origin stories, if you're a superhero guy, as I am, origin myths matter a lot. And when we tell the wrong origin myth, when we mismyth ourselves, then it makes it possible for us to believe untruths because we're saying that what was the thing that started us was true even when it wasn't.
That makes sense. So, in your book, you say how much of this was conscious on the part of white people. Much of it certainly, but it was also the water in which we swam, just the way things have always been. I'd love to apply that to a few different specific topics that we're dealing with today.
Yeah,
So,
of course.
so how would much of today's debates about voting rights, for example, involve conscious myth making as opposed to simply being the water that white conservatives are swimming in?
Yeah. And that's a powerful manifestation of a couple of the different myths that I write about in the book. The kind of overarching, I don't know, epistemological myth, which is basically that white people are superior and that black people, brown people, all other people are inferior. Also leads into a second myth that I talk about early in the book, which is maybe we're the same species, which some people denied, all the way up into the 20th century. But even if we are the same species, white people are superior in terms of their intellect, in terms of their ability to govern. And then the final myth that sort of fixes this debate about voting rights is the idea that we are intended to be separate from each other. And white people are intended to have the power, and black people are intended to sort of accept their lot in life. And so if you take sort of this range of myths, what it does is it tells you either that black people are not worthy of the vote, or that when given the vote, they will mishandle it, or that there is, because we don't know much about them, because we are segregated from people who don't resemble or worship or live like us, we're able to think the worst about them. And it's the same sort of thing when we talk about immigrants. They're eating the cats, they're eating the dogs. No, they're not actually eating the cats and the dogs. But if we have people that we have pushed away from us and we're not familiar with, and if we have set up these boundaries and barriers that say we are superior and they are inferior, then it becomes possible to believe a whole lot of things of them. And it becomes much more acceptable for us to take away their rights. So, the Supreme Court can say, well, there's not a racism problem anymore, which is another of the myths that I write about. And therefore, we don't have to think about race when we think about voting. We can set aside that work that John Lewis did and bled for and almost died for to get rights for all Americans. So it's a bunch of those myths that are sort of working together that become a comfortable way of taking people's rights away from them and ensuring our own.
It seems to me that in a lot of these conversations, like I know you focus on the white and black conversation in your book, but like, with the Southern Baptist Convention and women or with the immigration topic, like a lot of this is based on separation and superiority.
Yeah, it's absolutely what we would think of as a caste system, which of course Isabel Wilkerson has written about so brilliantly, and I include her work and some of the other sort of formational people around that. For us in America, it's a racial caste system. In other countries, there are other ways that people in positions of power have maintained their positions of power. But it is all about mustering these myths in support. And you're right. So whether we're talking about immigrants, whether we're talking about women, whether we're talking about gay people, it's a way of othering people and putting these sort of us and them boundaries up. And us, we are the privileged people. We know best. They are dangerous and difficult, and probably would be better if they weren't around us. And so, I mean, just thinking about topicality, when you invite millions of people to leave the country because you don't like the color of their skin, I mean, that is a version of our formation myth at work, but it's not one that people used to say out loud because they would lose their reputations, their livelihoods. When people used to hint at this great replacement theory, people would make fun of them. And now it's said openly. It's said in debate. It's said from pulpits. It's said, on all sorts of internet discourse. And one of the reasons that I think this book matters so much is that I started writing it many years ago, but the racial situation has become increasingly more tense and more obvious because people are saying the quiet part out loud now. We don't want black and brown people in our country. We just don't want them because they're not white, because they pollute our blood. Whatever version of those myths you want to think about. We're going to stay in power. You guys can leave. That would be great. You'd probably
Yeah.
be better off on your own.
They're changing our culture is another one that I've heard.
Yes. And I mentioned in the book, I do a lot of work with Robert Jones, the writer and founder of PRRI, the Survey and Study Institute. And we were doing a talk together in Paris, and I had seen a bunch of election advertisements as I was out shopping for my girls. And they were all talking about our culture and our civilization. And it will not surprise you, like these were all far right white
Hmm.
politicians. And when I asked Robbie about this, he said something that has stuck in my head, and I'm hoping it will stick in our listeners, viewers' heads as well. Robbie said, whenever you hear somebody use the word our culture, our country, our civilization, it is always a white supremacist tell. And
Interesting.
what we're talking about here is, a group of people, we were talking about white Christian nationalists. Um, that white part is not incidental. It's more important than the Christian part. And when we hear people saying, they're diluting our blood or they are changing our culture, what they're actually saying is we are nervous because these people are changing the world around us, which is what immigration has always done and has always done it for the better. We're a more thoughtful, harder working, more creative country because of immigration, and our food is like so much better. So it's just one of those things where it's very clear that when people do that our language, what they mean is people who look exactly like me.
Yep.
And so that they are drawing that Venn diagram very, very narrowly.
So, how do you see the return of the Confederacy playing into all this and all of the myths around the Confederacy? Because, like, when I grew up in the South, in Georgia, South Carolina, I was always told the Civil War was about states' rights. And yet, there's so much of the centralizing of power in Donald Trump at the federal
Yes.
government today. So, like, how does all that kind of fit together with all this?
Oh, well, a big part of it, there's actually, I think right here, maybe right behind that stack of books, there's a book by Heather Cox Richardson. It's called How the South Won the Civil War. And basically, what she says is that there is this very powerful cultural movement. So the South lost the military battles. They lost, the strategic battle, but they won the culture war. And the North was very quick to forgive. And the North agreed that in general, white people were superior. And so, even though there was an attempt to create some kind of fairness in those early years of Reconstruction, white people in the North struck a compromise with white people in the South and said, okay, we're in this together. And one of the great sort of classic cultural representations of this is the 1915 film, The Birth of a Nation. And what people need to understand is that that title is not about, the winning of the Civil War. It's about the creation of a white United States despite the Civil War.
Hmm.
And so you and I were raised in very similar ways, raised to idolize the South, raised probably to think about the sort of great light that went out of civilization, when Pickett's charge failed at Gettysburg. And over the years, it's collapsed into each other so that white people just in general have agreed that this whole racial thing is a problem, but that slavery was not such a bad thing. And the other kind of manifestation of it is just this sort of ascendant white Christian nationalism. You see a lot of these figures from the South, not all of them, but many of them are just sort of living out what they've been taught. And what they've been taught is that they are masters of the universe and it's time to reclaim their birthright. And so that's one of the ways that I think you can see the lost cause being lived out. But the big thing for me in terms of myth is just the simple fact that the whole issue of slavery becomes sidelined in the way that you and I were taught. This was a war about states' rights. And early on in Ken Burns's Civil War, Shelby Foote, the novelist and historian from Mississippi, tells a classic and maybe an anachronistic story, but a Southern soldier is talking to a Northern soldier. And the Northern soldier asks what they're fighting for, and they say, we're fighting because you're down here. So, the things that the Civil War was about get pushed to the side in favor of the things that people in power would like for it to have been about.
So, how can we start to uncouple some of these myths of Christian nationalism from what it means to be a Christian? And I'll give like one example. One of the myths I've seen is like the appeal to heaven flag shows up all
Yeah.
over these
Yeah.
events. And for a lot of
Yeah.
Christians, they're like, you try to point that out, like this is a meme, an issue here, but they're like, oh, well, are you saying it's wrong to appeal to heaven? I'm simply praying to God for my country. And so that kind of, I
Yeah.
feel like gets to into that water that you're swimming in part of it that you were talking about.
Yeah, and I've read a bunch of books over the last couple of years about reconstructing faith and reading the Bible in a healthier way. Um, I talked with John Fugelsang about his book, Separation of Church and Hate. Talked with a couple of other folks that have written books about how do we read the Bible better. I think that for people who are Christian, I think one of the things is that we have to do a better job of talking about the Bible and talking about our faith. And I'm not a huge like debate argument sort of person. But it does seem to me that when I find myself in a situation where we're having a Christian argument about race, it becomes possible to use whatever form of authority that particular Christian respects. And if that's scripture, which is the tradition that I grew up in, the Baptist tradition, then that's where I'm going to go. I'm going to talk about the thousands of verses about the marginalized. I'm going to talk about Matthew 25. I'm going to talk about all the places where Jesus refuses secular power in order to help bring around into place the beginnings of the kingdom of God. And It doesn't necessarily change people. I spend a lot of time on the interwebs taking a look at far right Christian arguments, and they are often locked in. Their identity is so tied up in the arguments that they're making, in the positions they hold, that, as James Baldwin says in The Fire Next Time, to ask them to change that would be like if you walked outside and the sun and the moon no longer existed in the sky. So these are foundational things for them, whether it's culturally or religiously, politically, or all of those kind of rolled in together. But racially is definitely a part of that. And so the practical question that you're asking, I think, has to be at least in part trying to engage people who are willing to engage, but also recognizing that there are people who are not. And I'm gonna shake the dust from my feet when I encounter somebody like that on Twitter, and just go on and try and live into the understanding of Jesus that I have. Um, I think the other thing maybe that goes along with this, I'm Episcopalian, and Episcopalians traditionally are really bad at evangelism. But because I was raised Southern Baptist, I'm like this Episcopal evangelist. I'm going to talk about Jesus. I'm going to live for Jesus. And I think one of the most important things that the kind of people that Dr. King called people of conscience can do, even if we say, okay, there are people over here on the far right who are so locked into this identity that they can't step away from it. Like, we don't know even what it would take. Um, but then the damage that they're doing to the reputation of Christianity in America by living out their faith in this militant, very secular, very political way can be militated against if there are other people willing to reclaim the Jesus of the Gospels and the prophetic tradition from the Hebrew Bible. And that's one of the reasons that I like John Fugelsang's book so much, is because basically he's just saying, this is not how Jesus understood what he was doing. And the person that I refer to in my tradition is our former presiding bishop, Michael Curry, one of the great preachers in America. And his basic thing, if he had to have an elevator speech on Christianity, he would say it's love. It's all about love. If it's not about love, it's not about God. And so to maybe live those things out in the culture in a way that people understand that there are options and that there actually is disagreement in the Christian faith about how we treat these issues, how we think about political power, how we treat the least of these.
So how do white people who want to be more honest about these conversations and who have a growing awareness and have been learning, they start to talk about these things? How can white people have those conversations about the past without falling into this intellectual white savior podcaster trap?
Yeah. Well, there are a couple of things that I've noticed. And I spent 5 years actively doing research, writing, collaboration on the book. But before that, I spent more than 10 years doing these sort of race and film conversations, usually with Black theologians, Black pastors, Black priests. And often those were in mixed race spaces or largely white spaces. But one of the things that I think is useful is that shared story, can help us get around some of the walls that we put up. So I talk about it as somebody who has spent enough time with family at Thanksgiving. There are often really serious disagreements about a bunch of things up and down the table. And so people are sitting there in their entrenched spaces, and your crazy Uncle John is going to say the crazy things that he says. But when you've got a shared story, when you're watching a film, when you're watching Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, or you're watching Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing, or Ava DuVernay's Origin, you actually are able to step out of your entrenched position and talk about the characters who are in the story. And the same thing can happen with books, although it is much harder to get people to read books. I've had books selected for a whole lot of, like one church, one book events, and nobody in the church ends up reading the book. So the movie version of things is actually a really good way to begin those conversations, but it's only begin. And so, sort of quickly, I'll move through this. I mentioned Jamar Tisby's Color of Compromise earlier. So, a great book from a great Black historian about the complicity of the American church in American racism. And toward the end of the book, and then the subject of another book on anti-racism, he's come up with a kind of quick acronym that works in a very powerful sense. I think there are some things that white people need to add to it, but ARC is the way that he thinks about it. Awareness is the first thing. And one of the reasons that I did so much talk about film and race was that during the pandemic, there were a bunch of churches who had had a moment of awareness around the murder of George Floyd. And a bunch of people who looked like me, who looked like you, said that's not a thing that would ever happen to me. And I think I begin to see something. So awareness is that first place that we talked about earlier, the information, the counter myths. You need to have some awareness of the actual truth. But the problem is that most people stop at the point of awareness. And they say, okay, I saw what happened to George Floyd, and it was terrible, and I'm not a racist anymore. And often what happens is that people not only stop at the place of awareness, but they backslide from there. So the place that we're in 2026 is so much retrograde to where we were in 2020 when I was talking with all of these churches about George Floyd. So the thing that follows that, the R in ARC, is relationship. And it's an essential thing, particularly for people who look like us, because what Robbie Jones's PRI data indicates is most white people don't have a black friend. Mm-hmm. That's one of the myths that I write about. And often we mistake acquaintance or employment for friendship. And what we say to ourselves is, I know and like this person. I like this brown person. I like this trans person. And therefore, I can't be any of the phobias. But when you get deep into most of those relationships, they're not relational. I used to think that I had this relationship with the woman who served me at Panda Express at Baylor. And then as I was working on this, I have a Black friend chapter because I actually do have Black friends. I was thinking about this woman, and I was thinking, I don't even know her name. I have seen her several times a semester for a good 10 years. She's always kind to me. She makes sure that I get the orange chicken that I want. And I don't even know her name. And so the relationship piece is essential. The first time that Kelly Brown Douglas, the great Black liberation theologian, talked with me about having to have the talk with her son Desmond. And in Black households, the talk is not the birds and the bees. It's about how you walk out in the world and behave in such a way that you come home alive. Like, until she told me about her experience and about Desmond's experience, it was all just awareness that was intellectual. All of a sudden, now here is a person who I love and respect. And she is telling me a thing. And not only can I not look away from this, but I'm inspired to do more because I love her. And I want her life and I want her son's life to be better. And that leads to the last thing that Jamar talks about, which is commitment. So you're aware and you don't backslide, roll over, go back to sleep. You enter into relationships so that you can actually know what the situation is on the ground, know what people are thinking, know what they want. And this, comes to your white savior question. President Trump has said on multiple occasions, only I can save us. And that is not the posture you want to take when you are serving alongside somebody who is suffering, somebody who's marginalized. You don't want to take away their agency, but at the same time, you also want to take on responsibility for what's possible for you. So for me, I have a platform, I have a voice, I have words. I don't have financial resources, although I have friends who do and use their financial resources in ways that are compatible with, working on voting rights or working on this issue or that issue. But the important thing about commitment is that there are a variety of ways that you can approach this, and this building of relationship and this ongoing understanding that this problem has been in place for hundreds and hundreds of years, and it's going to take a while to solve it. So I think the last thing that I would say here, I mentioned in the book a woman named Dr. Catherine Meeks, who I've had the pleasure of learning from and being friends with for a number of years. She's a Black historian and theologian, and she is a major force in the Episcopal Church around racial healing and racial reconciliation. And the reminder that she gives white people is so, so, so important. Because what she says is that white people want racial reconciliation to be a sprint. So that moment of awareness, I'm not a racist and I'm done. But even if you stop being individually racist, the systems that have been in place forever still need to be dismantled. Isabel Wilkerson talks about it sometimes about, we inherited this old house. We didn't build it. We didn't put in the faulty wiring. It's not our fault that the roof is leaking. But what are we going to do about it? Because it's our house and it's on us to repair it. And so the thing that is both hard and beautiful is that this is a process that's going to take a while. But when you're in relationship, I looked at a bunch of those pictures from Alabama a couple of weeks ago. When people were marching in Selma again and marching at the Pettus Bridge, where John Lewis was beaten almost to death. And I thought, it is horrible that we have to do this again. And it's great that we have each other.
Well, I know it's hard to find honesty these days around conversations like this, and especially with history of religion and politics, when we have so much to benefit from it all too. So I appreciate you coming on and sharing all that with us. Is there a place where people can go to find out more about your book or to purchase it?
Well, of course, you can go to our friends at the Amazon. They will sell you anything on the planet. If you've got a great small bookstore, independent bookstore, authors always prefer that. We love to keep good bookstores in place. And you can also order directly from Oxford University Press. And in any of those spaces, you'll find more information about the book. You'll be able to read a little bit about it, see the table of contents, see the kind of subject matter that I'm dealing with. And then, fortunately, I'm going to be talking to folks like you. And we're going to get the word out about the book and wrestle with some of these horrifying old myths, but try and hold them up to the light so people can see them in broad daylight and say, no, I don't want that.
That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. Please like, subscribe, and rate us on your favorite podcast platform, and we'll be back with another episode on Monday.
This has been another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. The episode you've just heard is part of a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State. Be sure to follow BNG daily at baptistnews.com and subscribe to get notifications about future episodes. Baptist News Global is a national nonprofit news service that is independent, free, and faithful. BNG is supported by readers and listeners like you. Learn more at baptistnews.com.
This episode was produced and edited by Mac Bowles of TKG Communications, LLC, Dallas, Texas.